Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think we have more people to come, but I think we'll make a start anyway. Thank you for joining us for this event, focusing on net zero and levelling up and what they could mean for Yorkshire and Humber region. It's an event organised by the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission. I'm Andy Gouldson, I'm Director of the Climate Commission. And this evening we have an esteemed group of panelists to have an open discussion followed by a Q&A session where you can feed in and we can discuss these issues more broadly. We're very, very pleased to welcome David Shukman, former BBC environment journalist, who will be kind of comparing and guiding the conversation through the evening. And also to introduce or to welcome Mike Jacobs, Professor of Political Economy from the University of Sheffield, and with an esteemed background in climate policy throughout the UK, notably through his role in the adoption of the Climate Change Act. And also Rebecca Willis. Becky also has a really impressive background in green politics, having worked with the Green Alliance, but now who works with the Lancaster Environment Centre and is really well respected for her work on politics and democracy and citizens' juries and so on. And then I'll also be feeding into the conversation to talk about economy and jobs. So these are two enormous aspects of current policy in the UK. We've seen the launch of the net zero strategy in October last year. And then more recently, the publication of the levelling up agenda. And it seems to us that, you know, they're clearly linked and they clearly have the potential to join forces and shape life in Yorkshire and Humber. So we wanted to have a chance to discuss them and explore what they might mean and to discuss how Yorkshire and Humber can make the most of bringing them together to promote its climate agenda on the one hand, but also to tackle inequities and some of the justice aspects of this conversation on the other. So at that stage, I'm going to hand over to David Shukman, who's going to guide us through the evening. Just before I do, if you have any questions that you want to post, please post them in the Q&A box. Please also upvote your favourite questions and we will tackle them in order as we go through when we get to the discussion section. If you have any technical problems, please use the chat function. And when we get to your question, we may ask you to unmute so that you can ask your question directly. The event is being live streamed on YouTube and is being recorded as well, so we will put it on our website. If you don't want to be identified, please select anonymous and ask for your questions to be read out. That's absolutely fine. And if you're on Twitter and want to join in the conversation, then please follow us via the details below. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to David. David, thank you for being with us and for your input this evening. We're looking forward to you guiding us through this conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Andy, and the team on the commission. I thought I might just begin with a few remarks that just set the context of, I think, where we are with the net zero story. I mean, the first is there's no particular order to these, but they're on my chest and it might help to get them off it, I think. One is that, of course, Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has shifted the world on its axis in an uglier direction, and I think arguably made many things less predictable. I mean, whatever one thinks of the way the UK government handled the hosting of COP26 in Glasgow last November, I don't think anyone could have predicted that today the UK Prime Minister would be in Saudi Arabia begging the Saudis to pump out more oil. On the other hand, one could argue that the case for renewable energy and for greater energy efficiency has never been stronger, given the high prices of oil and gas on the global markets and so forth. Not only is the payback time for investments in renewables and efficiency going to be quicker, given the high market prices, but also, interestingly, renewables in particular, well, and energy efficiency measures are now not only framed as measures to help tackle climate change, but they're also can be framed as measures to help with energy security. at a time of difficulty internationally. At the same time, it's fascinating to see how life goes on. I was in Hull on Monday to help with the launch of a coalition in Hull to push for net zero by 2030. And as I said to the gathering, I woke up that morning, Monday morning, having to pinch myself because I've been covering climate change for best part of 20 years. And if someone had said to me even a few years ago that you're going to get in one room in a city the size of Hull, the CEOs of businesses very large and very small, senior people from the university, the local hospitals, the city council, different elements of civic society, theatres, sports clubs, all with the same objective of achieving net zero in this coming decade. I would have said that they were barking. So it's extraordinary in a sense how not only has the ground just shifted, I mean, Hull is the latest example of many up and down the country, but just the way, despite everything, other global events and all the rest of it, other demands on people's time, COVID, there's a long list of other crises. Despite all of that, this agenda seems to be gathering momentum in a really interesting and positive way. Again, no particular order to these observations, but it's clear from reading the press, picking up comments that have been briefed by different elements in number 10 or around number 10, that there's a pretty active debate going on at the highest levels of government about aspects of net zero. Clearly, there are people who wish it to be slowed down, even ditched. There was a comment in one of the Sunday papers from a Downing Street official saying net zero is dead, followed pretty swiftly afterwards by others saying, no, it isn't. I mean, including the business secretary. In Hull, Alex Sharma was there, senior government minister and president of COP26 and in charge of the climate negotiations globally until November, making a very robust defense of net zero for all the reasons I've just mentioned. But I suspect those arguments have not fully played out. There are powerful vocal characters who are pushing for fracking and all the rest of it. And there's a clutch of newspapers who are in tune with that kind of thinking. So I think that's still to come, to be fully played out. In terms of leveling up and the connection with net zero, kind of what I find fascinating and also probably concerning from talking to different experts in the field and people involved in these different policies is first of all, it's fine to have the promises, but what about delivery? And I think there are, when the levelling up policy was unveiled, immediately there were questions, weren't there, about whether there's enough funding for this? You know, is the government really putting its shoulder to the wheel on that? Which I think raises a difficult question, which I think we'll get into during the course of the evening, which is whether the policies and the measures that support the levelling up agenda can be constructively synchronized and be in step with the measures and policies to support net zero. I mean, there are obviously many, many ways in which one set of agendas can support the other, but they've got to, the timing has to work in terms of businesses making investment decisions, in terms of training programs to prepare people for new jobs, for those investments to create the jobs that the people who've gone through the training might then find themselves in, and getting all of that harmonized and synchronized, I think is definitely a challenge. And then just to conclude these remarks with, if you like, a kind of global perspective, because I do think it's important to remember the context all the time in these discussions, although we're talking about a region tonight. You know, there is the climate scientists' challenge, you could say, as laid out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports last month and last August, that the only way to head off the most dangerous rises in temperature, with all of the risks that that would bring in terms of extreme weather and all the rest of it, is if the world collectively somehow manages to halve its emissions by the end of this decade. And I find when I'm discussing climate change with all kinds of different people, I think sometimes people lose sight of that. And I just think if you do keep that in mind, that objective, that imperative actually, to have the remotest chance of keeping the rise in temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, bearing in mind that we're at 1.1, the only way to do that is with really drastic cuts in emissions starting now. No good leaving it till the last minute and then trying to plant a few trees. That doesn't get you anywhere. And my last point before we sort of get into hearing from our panelists is that there was a great tweet that did the round. Some of you may have seen it a few months ago, and I wish I could remember who dreamt this up, but the observation was made that the great problem at the moment is we're getting all these promises. There's an awful lot of commitments being given, but we're probably seeing too much net and not enough zero when it comes to discussions of net zero. And I really sympathize with that view. I think we're possibly in an age, a sort of tsunami of greenwash and potential insincerity. I mean, I've never known such engagement from so many sectors of society in this agenda, but at the same time, it brings with it an awful lot of hot air. And I think the key thing is, I was taking part in a conference last week, and someone phrased it this way, to close the authenticity gap between rhetoric and reality. So look, that's enough from me to get us going, and it leads me to introduce our first panelist, Michael Jacobs. Andy, as you've outlined, Michael is Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sheffield. I first met Mike when he was working in Downing Street for Gordon Brown, working on climate change. You mentioned the work that was done on the Climate Change Act, which remains a kind of cornerstone of UK policy. And then there was the build up to various COPs, crucially the Copenhagen COP in 2009, that wasn't the success many had hoped for it. Michael was in the thick of all of that. Michael, over to you, and just give us a 5-minute kind of summary of the main points that are bubbling in your mind right now, and then obviously we'll come back to you for discussion and Q&A. But Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, David, and thank you to the Commission for organising the event and inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to start with, as you said, David, the two government documents, or perhaps it was Andy, the two government documents, the strategies which have been published in the last 6 months, which combined to give us the title of this session. The net zero strategy published in, I'm sorry, I didn't have the video on. The net zero strategy published in October, and the levelling up strategy published just a couple of weeks ago. And anybody who has thought at all about, I would say, both either levelling up or net zero, let alone a government that is that claims to be thinking about both, would have thought that these two documents would be pretty well integrated. It is fairly clear, I think, how net zero policy, so policy that is designed to create jobs and improve local economies and so on, can be aligned with the net zero strategy. There are lots and lots of jobs, as we know, in green areas of the economy. And similarly, it's well known now to anybody who's thought about climate change policy that if we don't achieve net zero in a way that people feel is fair and that provides opportunities and not disproportionate costs to everybody in society, it won't be politically supported. That's why we have a concept of the just transition. So this really was an opportunity to integrate these two big commitments that the government has made to net zero and levelling up. And we could forgive perhaps the net zero strategy for not having very much about levelling up. But once the net zero strategy had been published, I really was expecting the levelling up white paper, which is 330 pages long, to show how levelling up was to incorporate and partly be achieved through the policies that the government is also putting forward to achieve net zero. And I have to say, I was deeply, deeply disappointed. And I'm extremely worried, in fact, because the levelling up white paper has almost nothing in it about net zero. Despite the obvious areas of synergy in housing policy, in local economic development policy, in transport policy, in nature policy, all of which are referenced, there is only one section of the report, of the main report, which is on net zero, and it's rather tellingly in a box. As anybody who has read government white papers, or indeed been required to write a report of various kinds, if there's something which you think you ought to say, but you can't, doesn't seem to fit your argument, you put it in a box. And to see net zero in a box, and nowhere else, really did say to me that these agendas and the thinking about them have not been integrated in government. And it's not as if there wasn't time to do so. The net zero strategy took quite a long time to be produced. And then there was another 6 months for levelling up strategy. So there was plenty of opportunity to do so. Many of the people who made submissions to both documents tried to integrate the two. And the synergies are so obvious in those areas that I've mentioned and in others. So I found this deeply worrying. I was particularly surprised because Michael Gove, who's in charge of the levelling up white paper, has proved himself when he was Environment Secretary to be quite green, rather to many people's surprise. He took on many of the arguments of the environmental movement, and the Environment Act, which he was responsible for, is, if it's used correctly, quite a radical piece of legislation, not dissimilar from the Climate Change Act, which, as David says, I was involved in. But that thinking has not come into the levelling up white paper, and that does worry me. We know also that the levelling up white paper is much better on analysis than it is on policy. There is a yawning gap, as many people have said, between the analysis of how geographically unequal the UK is in chapter 1 of the levelling up white paper, and the very intelligent analysis of the reasons why in chapter 2, and the policies which the government is now committed to making in chapter 3. And I recognise chapter 3 very well, because when I was in government, the first attempt at a cross-governmental climate change plan that the Labour government under Blair and Brown introduced, the so-called Climate Change Programme Review in 2006, was a terrible exercise in going round the government, saying, all the government departments saying, what can you give us on climate change? With no central authority coming from the Prime Minister. I was at that point with Gordon Brown as Chancellor. 3 years later, after we'd passed the Climate Change Act, largely because of public pressure to do so, not least from Friends of the Earth, which was the major campaigner for a climate change bill as it first was, we did a similar exercise, but with tremendous central authority from Gordon Brown, saying, I want this to achieve much tighter environmental climate change targets. And we then produced the climate change, what we call the low carbon transition plan, which was really quite a radical document and overturned most of our energy and climate change policy. Because it had a central drive from the Prime Minister saying to every department, don't just give us what you've already done, but give us new policies to meet these much tougher targets. And we're going to drive this from the centre. And that's what the chapter 3 of the Levelling Up White Paper isn't. It is a collection of mostly the things that government was already planning to do in different parts and it clearly has not been driven from the centre. On the contrary, it's been put in reverse gear from the centre. Rishi Sunak's fingerprints are, I'm afraid to say, all over it. There is not enough money in any of the areas that Northern councils and Transport for the North and others were looking for. As we know, the Northern Rail Plan was deeply disappointing, didn't include the thing which everybody wanted, which was the Cross-Pennine Railway route. And the net zero strategy was also underfunded. And that is, I'm afraid, a responsibility of the Chancellor, as we know. The opportunities in Yorkshire and Humber are huge in this field. There are vast numbers of homes that need to be insulated. there is an embryonic industry, offshore wind industry in this region. We have lots and lots of nature solutions which we can implement. We have huge public transport needs and so on. So the opportunity to level up Yorkshire and Humber through an integrated net zero strategy is enormous. But unfortunately, the 2 pages on Yorkshire and Humber in the levelling up strategy only refer to things that have already happened. There are no new plans identified for this region in the strategy. So I have to say, as somebody who has been in government, I recognise a very poor, siloed, non-integrated process in this. And given the urgency of the climate crisis and the urgency, I would say, of the levelling up agenda, that is deeply disappointing.
Mike, thank you very much for that, and in particular for that insight into the heart of government when you were there. I mean, to what extent do you think it is difficult for any government just to marshal all the different ministries with all their separate agendas and priorities onto a twin track policy of levelling up and net zero? I mean, just tune up for a moment all of the various distractions what might think of for this government, but just for any government. I mean, from what you're saying, that first attempt when you were in number 11, it's hard, even for a relatively well-organized government.
It is hard, but it isn't impossible. And the second example that I gave of when we did have a drive from the centre, and when we had quite a lot of public support by then, there was a big climate movement and that was active, and that always gives politicians permission. But to be perfectly honest, there's quite a lot of public support, as I think we'll hear later on this evening, for the public for net zero and climate policies. When you've got that pressure from the outside, and when you've got the drive and the kind of central authority coming from the Prime Minister, if necessary, overruling a Chancellor, then you can do it. And we have done it before. And that wasn't the only example of the Labour government, certainly, trying to drive an agenda from the centre that required lots of government departments to do things. I would say it's actually easier when it's place-based, because in places, you don't get such siloization. So what I mean is some separate departments doing separate things. So if you come to Yorkshire and Humber and you bring together council leaders, business leaders, civil society leaders, trade union leaders, they will know where the jobs can be created, how much investment is, and they won't be saying, oh, that's transport, it's not net zero. Oh, that's industry, it's not net zero. It's much more integrated, actually, at a local and regional level. And so the Levelling Up White Paper, had it been organised around that integration, I think would have been relatively easy to do. I suspect the Yorkshire and Humber Commission that who was hosting this event would say that they know lots and lots of ways in which you could integrate those two agendas in the regional and local communities.
You also mentioned the Treasury. I mean, is there something institutional about just the Treasury? I mean, leave aside the current Chancellor, but I mean, just treasuries historically, do they sometimes have a problem with the vision thing and joining up policies that may to them appear kind of dangerously radical and open-ended in terms of financial commitments? I don't know. I mean, you know, you work closely with the Treasury.
Yes, I have, and I worked very happily in the Treasury for 3.5 years, and I would say no. And the reason the reason that you have asked that question is there is this kind of myth about the Treasury that it is very conservative, it's very neoclassical in its economics, very orthodox. And the grain of truth in that, there's always a bit of a truth and a myth, is that most of the economists in the Treasury are rather orthodox. Their general role in life is to say no. Basically, they are the department that controls public spending. And if you add up all the spending that is put to them by the department, it always adds up to more than can be afforded, as you would expect. And so they spend a lot of time saying no. So those two things are true. But in the end, the Treasury is not an independent institution. It doesn't have its own constitution. It is a creature of the Chancellor. And under Gordon Brown, the Treasury became a very radical exponent of development aid. We spent a lot of money on development assistance. We cancelled lots of debts of developing countries because that's what Gordon Brown wanted. It hadn't been what the Treasury had wanted before under previous chancellors. We spent a lot of energy on the voluntary sector because that was one of Gordon Brown's passions. The Treasury had never done that before. And the Treasury responded to the Chancellor. In 2009 to 10, Alistair Darling was Chancellor, and we had a big stimulus package to try and get us out of the financial crisis caused by the financial crash. Then George Osborne came in and we went into austerity. That was the same Treasury, the same civil servants, in the same teams, but they did different things because the Chancellor told them to. So I do think it's a myth that the Treasury is the problem. The Chancellor is the problem. And if this Chancellor were a pro-net zero Chancellor, he'd be spending more money on it.
And to what extent in a region like Yorkshire and Humber, and it's blindingly obvious, these synergies between the two policies as you've laid out, and everyone can see that. To what extent is, however obvious it is in that region, whichever region it is, some of the really big decisions do depend on getting the engagement of national government. And to what extent, because I mean, when you were in number 10, you had the banking crisis, the global banking crash to deal with, while you were trying to work on climate issues. I mean, presumably it is quite difficult. I'm not defending anyone here, but I mean, presumably it is quite difficult for politicians, civil servants, advisors to find the headspace to deal with these things when a big emergency like the Ukraine war right now crashes onto your desk.
It is, but in every crisis, there is an opportunity. And as you said, of all crises to occur now, one that is primarily about fossil fuels, or primarily about Ukraine, obviously, and democracy and liberty in Ukraine. But as far as its impact longer term and the national security impact of Russia's new turn into barbaric violence against its neighbor, there is the obvious synergy between energy independence and the climate change agenda. What's the best way of being less dependent on Russian gas and oil? It's to use less gas and oil. That is the energy efficiency agenda, which I think should be called the energy waste agenda. What we are doing is we are literally buying Russian gas and oil. We buy very little Russian gas, but Russian oil, Europe is buying a lot of Russian gas, and then wasting it in badly heated, badly insulated homes and giving the Russians money for it, giving Putin's regime money for it. This is ridiculous. So yes, we should be trying to integrate those agendas by saying the way we escape from dependence on fossil fuels is by going down the cutting weight energy waste, energy efficiency, renewables, and so on. And that's what we did with the banking crisis. We needed a massive stimulus as the response after we'd rescued the banks in order to get us out of what was turning into a huge slump. And what we and every other government tried to do was to make as much of that stimulus green. So there was quite a big green spending program in those early stimulus programs in the UK, the US, and in China and others. And we did that in a coordinated way through the G8. So it's not impossible for governments to multitask. Yes, the Prime Minister's focus will be on something else, but he's got plenty of other ministers to focus on this. So
we're all going to, I guess, await with bated breath the energy strategy document. I think it was promised at one point this week, but now it's, I gather, coming in several weeks' time. So we'll all see how they're going to, I mean, as you say, that's an opportunity to unify some of these different strands. We'll see if they grasp that. Mike, many thanks. We're obviously going to come back to you in the public Q&A session shortly. But our next panelist is Rebecca Willis. Becky is Professor of Energy and Climate Governance at the Lancaster Environment Centre. She was involved in a leading way in the famous Climate Assembly, bringing together citizens under, it was a measure introduced by the UK Parliament, wasn't it, under the Climate Change Act, to bring people together to really discuss different options for climate change. Becky was involved in the UKRI's energy programme, Sustainable Development Commission, and was director of the Green Alliance. So, Becky, great to have you join us on this panel. As with Mike, take 5 minutes and share with us the kind of points that are really burning in the forefront of your mind, and then we'll have a discussion about them afterwards. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, David. It's great to be here, and I feel very honoured that you have invited someone from the other side of the Pennines to join your debate. I think, I mean, I would absolutely agree with Michael's analysis of the Levelling Up white paper. Like I'm sure any climate policy watcher, the document lands and you do the Control F. to find every time they say climate or carbon or net zero. And you have this sinking feeling when you realise, as Michael says, it's just a box. So I wanted to look in particular at where, what this means and where we stand in terms of climate and the democratic debate. And I think that although the writers of the Levelling Up white paper might not have realised this, I think that we're at an absolute watershed moment for climate and democracy. Over the last 30 years, climate really hasn't featured very much at all in our democratic debate. And, Michael talked about the Climate Change Act, which is absolutely landmark. But when I did some really detailed research with MPs sort of 5 years ago, including some who were there when the Climate Change Act was introduced, they didn't actually remember much debate about it. If you asked them about that term in Parliament, what were the big issues? They said the ban on smoking indoors. They said some tax stuff. There was some terrorism measures, and they didn't even remember that they'd voted through the Climate Change Act because it wasn't political currency. It wasn't talked about in the corridors. So I think there's two reasons it wasn't. The first is that, at that point, there was a lot of decarbonisation that could be done essentially through technical means, through decarbonising the power system. And we didn't really need to ask people too much about that. And the second thing was just a huge degree of political caution. Again, these MPs told me that they didn't see a lot of political capital in flying the climate flag. And so what you got was a kind of climate policy by stealth. Stuff was happening. Michael was there to see it, as was I, but it wasn't, what people talked about. And things are changing now again, because of those two reasons. Firstly, it's not a technical challenge anymore. It's very much a social challenge. If you look at decarbonisation over the next decade, it's going to change people's jobs. It's going to change how we travel around. It's going to change what we eat. Or if we're going to be successful, it will change all of those things. So we can't get away with a sort of stealth approach anymore. And also, it is on the political agenda. It's on there because people put it there because they were concerned. We've seen, the school strikes, Extinction Rebellion. We've seen sky high levels of concern for climate, which have actually stayed remarkably stable during COVID. So we've seen, much more political pressure to act on climate. And then more recently, and I know there's some questions about this, I've been watching, we've seen Net Zero Watch, the, what was Vote Leave, reincarnated out on manoeuvres, which I'm very sceptical about, but I don't discount that threat by any means. So we're seeing climate change getting properly political again. So I really think it is a watershed moment. What does that mean for regional policy? Well, I can't crystal ball gaze on this, but given the inadequacies of the Levelling Up white paper, all I can do is tell you what I would like to see. And three things. The first is that we absolutely have to get away from a consumer focus, more towards a much more holistic account of who we are as people. And one of those things that we all, well, not all, but a lot of us are as people, as is workers. We need to think about people as citizens and workers as well as consumers. Government policy is overwhelmingly consumer focused. I've actually run the analysis on this, which I can tell you about, but people in net zero documents are seen primarily as consumers. I think that's just wrong. The second thing is actually, and again, Michael alluded to this, I think climate policy, it should be much more devolved. There should be much more responsibility given to local areas within a very clear national framework. So Climate Change Act, very clear sort of direction setting in sectors like transport, aviation and so on, but then leaving it up to local areas to do what they want to meet meet the targets, give them the responsibility and give them the freedom and the budget and the resources to get there. And then the third thing, and people won't be surprised that I say this because it's very much at the focus of what I do, to really lean into democratic engagement on climate change. There hasn't been much of a conversation about it. That's why Net Zero Watch have managed to sort of muscle their way in. There's a brilliant example actually in Leeds before the UK Climate Assembly that you mentioned, David. Leeds had one of the very first local processes in the form of a citizens' jury on climate change, which I helped with a little bit, and that provided a really good test ground actually for the national one. And it's great to see the findings from the Leeds Assembly feeding into the Leeds Climate Commission and other local strategy. And then of course we've had Climate Assembly UK, which recreated that on a national level, and lots of other areas have run their own processes. I think this is great, but they shouldn't be seen as one-offs. We need a much more sort of deliberative system, if you like, which helps to embed citizens' views and values in the whole process of climate policy making, which provides the kind of social intelligence that we need to design policy which works for people, which works with the grain of their lives. And I mean, funnily enough, political parties actually have really good skills on this because they do focus groups. That is absolutely their job to test the pulse of the nation. It's just that when they're in government, they forget about applying that to policy. So that's a real challenge, I think, but one that, if you get it right, helps you to design a climate strategy which not only is more popular but is more robust, because you've road tested it with the people who are going to work in these new industries, with the people who are going to hopefully change their diets and so on. And so I don't see the downside to doing that, but it does take a sort of level of confidence and coordination that we're just not seeing at the moment on net zero.
Becky, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for spelling all that out. You mentioned the net zero scrutiny group. I kind of nodded to it in my opening remarks. There's a question from Kate that's come in. Should we be concerned about Nigel Farage's anti-net zero campaign? And Catherine Porritt says, is it a real threat, or can we ignore him as a has-been? I mean, in my opening remarks, I was making the case that this question has not gone away and it's going to grow. Now, I don't know what your take is. And if you were to do the Climate Assembly UK again now, how much would that questioning of net zero, do you think, come up in that kind of debate?
So I think we ignore initiatives like Net Zero Watch at our peril. I think we're talking about them, so it must be working, right?
Yes, right.
But it's incredible that they've managed to have the impact they have, bearing in mind that the evidence is almost diametrically opposed to what they're saying in terms of climate science, and they're wanting to go slower in terms of the costs of net zero, in terms of which technologies to support. They've got that all wrong, and I say that that's not my opinion. That is objective. I mean, David, that's objective, scientific and economic evidence, which says that they're wrong. They're also on the wrong side in terms of public opinion, aren't they? We know that by looking at the public opinion data, whether the kind of, very detailed qualitative stuff that I do, or whether the top level polling. But what they do have is as many column inches as they want in influential newspapers and the ear of ministers in this government. And so that is a concern. We know that people aren't, neither politicians nor all of us as people respond to evidence in particularly linear or straightforward ways. And so we do need to take them seriously. But how do we take them seriously? By absolutely, getting on the front foot, and this is up to government to do this, and there's signs of it now, getting on the front foot and putting forward a really positive confident net zero narrative that works. In terms of whether we should have covered that at climate assembly, we did really.
If you were to rerun the climate assembly now, to what extent would you feel it might be brought up by people who were taking part?
Well, I mean, it was. We had people. So the participants in the climate assembly were, one of the criteria against which they were selected was that they were amongst those 100 people. They had the same attitudes towards climate change as the wider population, measured by the Ipsos Mori survey. How concerned are you about climate change? So we had people there who disputed the science, and they were really useful because they ask all the hard questions, right? So, I mean, it was a genuine debate. The target wasn't up for grabs. They weren't, you know, the question they had to answer was, how do we get to net zero by 2050? But the net zero scrutiny group aren't necessarily questioning that. They're questioning how to get there, which was exactly what we discussed at Climate Assembly. And, you know, I would say there were a few sort of diehard skeptics, as there are in the population, but the majority of participants, as with the majority of the population, were really concerned, but didn't have a good feel for what should be done, both, you know, either for themselves as individuals or as a country. And that's the group we've got to work with.
Sure. No, that's really, really interesting. Now, just to pick up on one of the points you made about devolving climate policy to a regional or local level, I mean, I suspect this will come up again. How does one do that in budgetary terms? I mean, there are going to be policies that require big investment, which would typically come from national government. So how does one square that?
Well, I'd like to get Michael's answer to this, having been in the Treasury. But I mean, the system I would like to see is where local areas have a clear responsibility on climate change. They have targets that they have to meet. Basically, the net zero target devolved. But then they also have the powers in terms of you know, legal levers and the budgets to meet them. So, you know, at the moment, what's happening, and if you talk to people in local government, as I've had, what's happening is that money is flowing to local areas, but it's in you know, in hundreds of little boxes, all called different things, all with different time horizons and different aims. It's just like, you know, it's really, really difficult to handle, even just kind of administratively. So we need a lot more freeing up. I mean, you know, the shouts of joy when Manchester actually managed to get back control of its own buses. I mean, that's so, I mean, it's brilliant, but trivial in the scheme of things, right, compared to what needs to happen on climate. But we need to see much more trust placed in local areas. And, you know, I don't really understand why central government doesn't do that now, given that so much of the policy, you know, land use, buildings, transport, is actually very place-based.
Becky, we'll come back to this, but thank you very much indeed, because I know there'll be questions coming in about all this, and we'll chuck them your way when they come in. But thank you for that. Well, look, our third and final panelist is Andy Gouldson. He introduced me, now I get to introduce him. So Andy is Professor of Environmental Policy at the University of Leeds, and he's Director, as you know, of the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, hosting this debate tonight. Andy's been involved in environmental policy and economics for many decades. Recently, the focus has been much more on climate, low carbon development, climate resilience, I know is a big theme for you, Andy, isn't it? And trying to bring together all the many stakeholders involved in some of enabling and enacting many of the policies on climate at a local and regional level. So Andy, you know the drill. You've got 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll get on with questions that are flowing in vigorously as I speak. Over to you.
Thank you. I was thinking about how best to approach this, and it drew me back to a project I was involved in as an advisor four or so years ago in Yorkshire. I won't say which part of Yorkshire, but it was looking at developing a long-term strategic plan for the area. And I was the climate advisor, and there were transport folk and housing folk and land use folk and infrastructure people and so on involved in the project. But fairly quickly, my role, not because of me, but just because the inherent aspect of the role came to the fore, because it became clear that this part of Yorkshire faced a decision between, a vicious circle of decline or a virtuous circle of development. And the vicious circle was the more likely outcome based on a kind of do-nothing scenario, because it faced a kind of pincer movement between climate risk and impacts, and flooding in particular, where more and more of the population and more of the infrastructure, more and more of the businesses faced, frequent disruption, intensive disruption, which could have scared them away from investing in the area, either literally through finances or through their energy and committing their long-term future to the region. So that climate risk was a major aspect. And on the other hand, you also had the high carbon jobs in that area at threat from low carbon and net zero priorities. And the lack of support and of a long-term strategy to address both of those issues, it was felt would have been a major obstacle to the long-term development of the region, with lack of investment, maybe even depopulation and deindustrialization, leading to a kind of compounding cycle where that just got worse and worse over time. On the other hand, we faced the prospect of a more virtuous circle where, with real investment and innovative investment in resilience, in flood protection, in land protection, nature-based solutions and so on, could have protected the area from climate risks. And also a just transition plan focusing on high carbon industries on the one hand, and protecting jobs and enabling the people and companies in those sectors to transition towards a net zero future, combined with green economic growth through offshore wind, for example, could have created the opposite scenario where you had an inflow of investment and population and economic development, which brought with it more infrastructure, which would then became, self-fueling. And to me, that was, a huge wake-up call, because it really did bring the climate arguments down to earth with a bump. And it said, actually, doing nothing wasn't an option. We have to do something. Otherwise, we face, massive regional inequalities and sub-regional inequalities too, as a result of climate change. So that was certainly part of my thinking, but I was also involved in a project which launched a report last week, looking at some of the weaknesses, I suppose, in the net zero strategy and the lack of emphasis and detail given to the delivery agenda. And this piece of work, which was conducted for BEIS, for the Department for Business, Energy, Innovation and Skills, was looking at the economic case for devolving power down to the local level to deliver on the net zero agenda. And it compared a kind of rather a caricature, I suppose, of a one-size-fits-all national strategy for net zero versus a much more devolved and place-based scenario. And the headline finding was that devolution halved the cost of delivering net zero and doubled or even trebled the benefits of investing in net zero, because rather like as Mike was saying earlier, places know what they want to invest in and where they can invest most effectively, and devolving power down to we were talking largely about the city region level, was massively effective on both the cost and the benefit side. And so then the question comes up, well, how on earth does that happen? And how can we link in net zero investment with levelling up agenda? And I have a mini announcement here, I suppose, which is that I've just been appointed as the lead climate advisor to the UK Infrastructure Bank. And the UK Infrastructure Bank has the combined agendas of levelling up and net zero. And it strikes me that one of the major opportunities from doing that is to join them both together. And the worst thing that could happen is you have the bulk of the money going into levelling up, which invests in high carbon or climate resilient infrastructure, for example, that is an attempt to levelling up, which is then undermined by the climate agenda. And when the opposite could be true, that actually net zero can be the way of delivering levelling up through fuel poverty, through better infrastructure, through more resilience and so on. But also how levelling up can be a way of supporting the net zero agenda. So to me, they really ought to be mutually supportive. And I think our job in the Yorkshire and Humber Commission, which I will be carrying on with, I'll have 2 half-time jobs. Our job in the Yorkshire and Humber Commission has been very much around how to operationalize this. It has to be said sometimes, despite national government or because of national government and its absence of attention to detail, is why we need so much more regional attention. And we were talking today in the Commission meeting about some very contentious issues. One of the questions is around airport expansion and aviation. In a way, the absence of a national aviation strategy there, hands a very, very tricky issue down to the local level in order to be resolved. And it's been massively divisive here in Yorkshire. And what we need is a supportive enabling policy at the national level, but then we need a subsidiarity arrangement where within that framework, power is then devolved to enable us to deliver on these agendas in a joined up way.
Andy, thanks for that. I mean, it prompts a question from me about, can you describe either a real example or a sort of fantasy, hypothetical example of where we've got the combination of everything? So the devolution, sufficient devolution has happened to a city or regional level, where the right level of funding is available, where there has been a climate resilient, climate positive, net zero supportive development. I mean, if there's a real one, that would be great to hear it. If there's a sort of one that you'd love to see that hasn't quite come to fruition for whatever reason, I think that would be enormously helpful just to air that.
I think maybe to have one of both, a real one and a wishful one. And the real one that really leaps to mind is the Living with Water partnership around Hull.
Yeah.
Hull is at risk from climate change, and massive flooding in 2007, and needs longer term protection, as does the whole of the Humber estuary area. Can't be done in isolation, one little pocket to be protected. The whole thing needs a joined up strategy. But what happened with Living with Water, as I understand it, is that Hull and Yorkshire Water and the Environment Agency and others in the city faced a choice. Do you, if you want to protect the city from extreme flooding, do you invest in concrete and steel and pipelines and pumps in order to build essentially a massive ring main around the city that when it floods you can pump the water out? If you're a civil engineer used to pouring concrete and steel, then it's probably what you would go for. But what they actually did is build a series of green nature-based solutions, natural flood bowls, which were much more popular, much more politically desirable. The co-benefits from a nature perspective, they were much lower carbon, also much better at resilience. And as I understand it, they've been massively successful. And that's a great example of protecting a city, protecting communities and infrastructure and all the people in and around Hull.
And I mean, actually, I don't know enough detail about that project, although I'm familiar with it to an extent. I don't know whether central government was involved. I mean, what you're arguing there, it was the various agencies and stakeholders in that city who were able to organise that.
Yes, it was very much a local partnership. I think it had government support, central government support.
Okay.
But in a way, it was necessity being the mother of invention. The cost of building a massive ring main would have been huge, and the carbon impact as well, and the disruption. And locally, the key actors got together and came up with a better way of doing it. And it's a shining example of what we could do more broadly.
So let's have an example that hasn't happened, that's hypothetically perfect, ticks all of the boxes that you and fellow panelists have outlined, but perhaps hasn't happened because of whatever reason.
Well, this isn't without controversy, I would say, but to me, the biggest opportunity potentially in the region is around carbon capture and storage. And the opportunity for CCS to protect high carbon jobs and sectors which otherwise could struggle to make the transition to net zero. but also could potentially act as a magnet for other industries to move into the region in order to gain access to that CCS network. I mean, within the region, we have such a comparative advantage of a cluster of high carbon sectors in close proximity to one another, also in close proximity to offshore gas fields where you could store a lot of carbon. That could be a way of both protecting and creating jobs in this region. And like I say, I know it's not without its controversy. It depends partly on how much faith you place in CCS. But the government has given more funding for that. As I understand it, things are moving forward now. The joint cluster between Teesside and Humberside in that area, is developing it. There are some confident statements that it's not unrealistic to think we could have a major CCS network in place and up and running within 5 years. And to me, that's the kind of thing that would address both of these agendas in a joined up way.
But I mean, would that work under the sort of devolution model that's being floated? I mean, that seems to me, when you've got something on that scale, it's going to require national government in a major way, isn't it?
Yes, I think it does. It's a national infrastructure project, and the scale of both Humberside and Teesside's industrial clusters and their carbon footprints, I think, warrants a national infrastructure investment in that space. But with that enabling policy again from national government, I think the scope for the region to build around that and to enable it to protect jobs and create jobs is really significant.
Overall, I know that, because obviously, you've touched on this with the Hull example, that climate resilience is a major theme for you. I mean, we are living on a planet that's a 1.1 degree hotter than it was a century ago, and the numbers are heading in the wrong direction. I mean, to what extent do you think, it doesn't happen in a linear way, each year is worse than the last, but I mean, looking ahead for the next few years, I'm afraid there are going to be some very, very uncomfortable and potentially dangerous extreme weather events. I mean, when those sorts of things happen, what's your sense about whether they change the dynamic of local, regional, perhaps even national decision making?
Well, so we had a commission meeting this afternoon, Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, and one of the presentations was from the Environment Agency presenting on the long-term forecast for the Humber region, the estuary area, and the flood maps for 100 years, even with 1 meter of sea level rise, and it could be as high as 1.4 meters of sea level rise, are really quite staggering. And that some people, some areas, some sectors are able to relocate, to bounce back, to invest and insure, and so on, in protecting themselves from that level of climate risk. But many of the poorer communities and the more disadvantaged areas clearly are not. And so those risks really do run the risk of creating or compounding, exacerbating existing inequalities. I think that there's a desperate need for more joined up thinking. And I think, for example, when you look at ELMS, the environmental land management schemes and sustainable farming initiatives, the potential to deal with this again through nature-based solutions and through re-wetting, the marshlands and the border areas around the Humber estuary is huge. But on the other hand, those areas are very productive agricultural land often, and they're pumped to be drained to be farmed. So you have a high carbon activity creating a climate vulnerability very directly. Is the policy framework around agricultural reform post-Brexit, post-CAP, going to enable those kind of highly productive lands to be taken out of production or compensated for flooding? It doesn't look like it at the moment. That other policy seems pitifully small in terms of its coverage. And I think in a way that's similar to both the net zero and the levelling up agendas. It's a big headline, but actually a lot of detail missing, and a lack of emphasis on delivery and a lack of funding. And you could look at it and think, okay, well, the state needs to be entrepreneurial, needs to invest in order to enable the country to thrive, rather than a kind of small state, small taxation, deregulated economy, which seems to be maybe where we're headed.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. So look, that concludes sort of that section of the evening where we've heard from our three panelists and explored some of their ideas. And we've now got just under half an hour or so to get into some of the questions. I've touched on one or two that came in already. So look, Andy, I know you said it's highly controversial. Of course it is. You touched on aviation. I mean, Mike McGrath Galba asks, would you like to comment on the inadequate aviation strategy of the current government as far as carbon emissions are concerned? I'll come to you in a second, Andy, on that. I mean, Mike, from your perspective, what's your take on aviation and the extent to which it would be helpful in a climate context to devolve much more decision making to a local or regional level?
Well, aviation is an issue. Aviation is one of the hardest sectors to decarbonize. We do now have some biofuels being used in aviation, but biofuels involve terrible risks to food production. If biofuels become really big, they will take over land that would otherwise have been used to grow food for people. Unfortunately, it is the case that globally, planes are richer than many people in the world. And that means that the demand for flying will outweigh the demand for food. So many Greens, I think, are very worried about a very large expansion of biofuels. And we still don't have any other means of flying planes than liquid fuels. So flying is a very difficult area because it is probably the hardest of all the areas that we have to decarbonize. It's also, of course, one of the most unequal. It is almost exclusively rich people who fly. Now, many in the audience may say, I'm not rich and I go on a holiday, obviously by the standards of the world as a whole, and even by the standards of most people in the UK, where the median salary, that is the middle salary of all the salary scale, is about £26,000 a year. So if you earn more than that, you're in the top half of the income distribution. And so flying is itself a rather unequal activity. I think we will see prices rise. I think the decarbonisation agenda requires more taxes. Aviation fuel is still not taxed. It's the only kind of fuel that isn't taxed. And it will become more expensive to fly. I would personally like to see a kind of tradable permit for flying. I think it would be a good idea to give us all the equivalent of say one short haul flight every 2 years, and then people who didn't want to use it could sell them to other people who could have more, which would actually be an income redistributive measure as well. That's obviously pretty radical, but the more obvious or the more likely solution is a frequent flyer levy, which is the more you fly, the higher tax you pay, which would also be a more equitable policy measure, I think. So I think this is difficult. I think it is particularly, however, something that has to be dealt with at national and even international level. I think regionalising aviation policy will just see lots more airports and new terminals and expansion of regional airports, which is obviously, in the short term, looks good for a region to have more flights coming in. You know, places like Bradford, Leeds will want flights coming in from all kinds of countries so that people can fly directly. That is a natural way of thinking about economic development. So I don't think this can be left to regional evolution on aviation. I think it is something that has to be done through national and then international agreement.
Thanks, Mike. And Becky, I'm wondering how this particular argument on aviation played out in the Climate Assembly and your sense of sort of where the public is on this. Because I mean, clearly, as Mike says, you know, that there's a sort of powerful attraction in economic development terms traditionally in a region to get an airport, particularly with international connections, and the business case can be very compelling. But there's a climate problem. I mean, how did that play out in your discussions with the citizens?
Yeah, I think generally on aviation, it's important to note that what the kind of thing we're looking at is in the shorter term anyway, is just aviation not expanding at the rate it's expanding, right? This isn't about shutting things down overnight, and opponents of net zero strategy tend to use that as a rhetorical device. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon herself, she's changed a bit, but she was always saying you can't close down North Sea oil and gas overnight. No, you can't overnight, but we're talking about a managed transition. In the case of aviation, stopping the expansion of aviation would be a really good first step, right? So let's be clear about what we're aiming for. And the Climate Assembly looked at aviation directly. People are receptive to, people like flying, people who do fly like flying. They understand the equity issues around flying. they are quite accepting of policies like a frequent flyer levy. They actually voted for a frequent flyer levy that also incorporated a sort of mileage dimension. So if you fly frequently and further, you pay more. I think there's a particular issue around fairness about, you know, for example, if you have a family overseas, you're arguably more sort of structurally dependent on flying. So it will be, I would say that the trickiest things to get right over the next 30 years will be diet and flying, in terms of, you know, things which impact on our lives. But in both of those, there is a way that you can steer it through. I would say, you know, why don't, you know, do some of the stuff that's really popular in terms of renewables, and start gently to have a debate about meat and flying and those, you know, the things which we know will be more controversial.
Becky, thanks. And Andy, how does this, I mean, I don't want to devote the whole of this debate to aviation, but it's a really good topic to discuss and get our teeth into. How did it play out on your meeting of the Commission this afternoon? I mean, obviously you've got different interests represented there.
We had a good discussion, and we've agreed that we will try and agree and publish a position statement on it within a couple of weeks. Speaking personally, so I stress this isn't the view of the Commission as a whole yet. I think that, you know, you look at the net zero strategy, you look at the Jet Zero initiative, and, you know, maybe if you're a technological optimist and you know, looking at the comments on CCS, maybe at times I am that, you might think, well, in the 2030s, maybe there's some scope for technological changes to decarbonize aviation. I'm not so optimistic about that personally. But really in the 2020s, it's hard to see there being any substantive changes to, you know, the carbon intensity of flying. And therefore, I think we need to do something about it more quickly, because we need to reduce emissions rapidly in the 2020s. And, you know, I think that the Leeds Bradford Airport experience, and they pulled their application to expand to build a new terminal a few days ago. I think it shows that, you know, we need a joined up national, if not international. But
sorry, the pulling of that plan, was that, what reason was given for that?
The reason they gave was because of the delays and the cost implications,
okay. Yeah.
And also their sense that they could expand the existing terminal more easily with existing planning permission, rather than going through a public inquiry and maybe a judicial review after that.
Nothing to do with climate then?
No, not really. No. I mean, to their credit, I think they say that they still want to make the terminal net zero, the airport itself, not the flights in and out of it. You know, obviously that's not the big issue. The big issue is all about the number of flights. Yeah. But yeah, they say the new terminal would have been net zero from in that narrow sense, and the expanded existing terminal would be net zero still. Yeah. So they actually, there was a point of agreement, I think. You know, that both the aviation sector and the climate lobby both want a national aviation strategy consistent with the sixth carbon budget, because then there would be clarity. And the lack of this enabling policy from government is causing all of this cost and delay and division. And you can really see that and feel that on the ground in Leeds.
That's so interesting. Now, look, as you mentioned, in looking at the Q&A box, there's a lot of interest in CCS, provoked by your comments, Andy. I mean, Catherine Porritt, what if CCS doesn't work? Which is a fair question, because it hasn't got many examples on an industrial scale so far, despite being talked about for years. I think I did my first story on CCS back in 2004 with optimistic graphics about pipelines under the North Sea. we are where we are. Ellen Rowbottom says it's an incredibly high-risk strategy, to put it kindly. Debbie Cobbett, it's part of the whole green growth of profit mythology, ? And pick up on this, because I think I was struck by one aspect of your comments on CCS, that there may be jobs in high carbon industries. Did you suggest that, you know, they would be at risk from net zero, and this adoption, pursuit of CCS may be a way of safeguarding jobs that would otherwise be at risk? In other words, framing it as part of a kind of an aspect of just transition. Is that what you were getting at?
Yes, I suppose I was. And I completely understand the points about not being skeptical until it's proven. And I think that the CCS has got potential to make a contribution and probably has to play a role pragmatically, as much as I understand the reticence and I understand some of the broader points around CCS as well. But yeah, to me, it's hard to make the case for saying we shouldn't explore it at the regional scale. And again, this is my personal view, not the Commission view by any means, but I think the potential for it to make a major contribution in an industrial region like Humberside or like Teesside is there, and it's hard to say. We can focus on the green economy opportunities like offshore wind on the one hand; they're great. Everybody's aligned on that, but then to say actually we're not interested in trying to protect the jobs in the high carbon sectors or provide a transition pathway for some of those sectors. To me, that doesn't seem fair or equal, and it seems somewhat unrealistic to think that we will transition away from some of those industries, like steel being one example, and therefore, pragmatically and not entirely comfortably, I have to say, I think that there is a role and a case for exploring the potential of CCS, and once it's proven, if it's proven, then I can see it could play a role.
Mike, where are you on this? I mean, I'm just looking at a comment from Simon Gibbon, who raises a question about the cyclical nature of heavy industry, coal, steel, chemicals, and whether if you go down the CCS track, it might not help the levelling up agenda, if I've understood that right. It'll inherently increase the cost of energy, he says, purely through the need for energy to do CCS, unlike renewable energy sources. I mean, where do you stand on that, Mike? And what's your sense about whether CCS, as Andy's suggesting, could play a role, provided it all works, in this region's context?
When I was in government in the mid 2000s, we first pushed CCS. We were the first government to try and give CCS a kick, and at that time, we thought it was going to be part of the energy solution, because we thought we would have some continuing coal-fired power stations and lots of gas-fired power stations, and we knew we needed to deal with the carbon dioxide that they would produce. And so CCS was a route to getting cleaner fossil fuels, if you like. Now we know we need to escape from fossil fuels. We've got no more coal-fired power stations, so that agenda has declined. But you will still have industrial emissions. Fossil fuels are used by industry, and industry produces greenhouse gas emissions. And if you want to deal with those emissions without just closing industries down, then CCS is almost certainly the way to do it. I am pretty convinced that it's technically possible. CCS has been done in many parts of the world on now quite commercial scale. But as the questioner says, it's expensive. Basically, capturing carbon and burying it must be more expensive than not capturing. And so carbon capture and storage is always going to be more expensive than not doing it. And now it is definitely more expensive as an energy technique than renewables. So I don't think it's part of our energy mix particularly, because I think we just need to get out of fossil fuels. But I do think it's part of the industrial mix. I'm not sure it's true to say that these industries are cyclical. Coal, steel, chemicals have been very long-standing industries. Obviously, coal is now largely phased out, but steel is still a vital material all around the world, and we still produce specialized steels. So are chemicals. There is no sign that the chemical industry is in decline. So unless we think we can replace all of those well-paid, unionized, good jobs with lots of others in a rapid process, I think we will need to see those industries continue, but then they will need to be greened. And I do think CCS is likely to be part of the solution.
Thanks, Mike. Becky, do you want to offer a comment on CCS? I mean, it's Debbie is saying, why obsess on CCS? How are we going to get on with the David's idea of investing both in new jobs and in the training for them, examples being a retrofit industry and low carbon food system. I mean, is she right that I mean, I'm putting words into Debbie's mouth here, that CCS, takes us down perhaps an unhelpful avenue?
I was
and generally, I guess.
I was gonna quote Debbie's point, why obsess on CCS? Because I mean, I do agree with Andy and Michael that it is a necessary, if we manage to do it, it is a necessary and useful technology to allow us to for things which there is no technological solution apart from carbon capture. I was part of a team at Lancaster who actually did a huge amount of research on the question which I think is really overlooked, which is to what extent does a focus on negative emissions technologies like CCS actually distract from and therefore harm the prospects for what you might call sort of traditional decarbonisation? And the answer is a huge amount. It distracts political attention, it distracts investors' attention, and you see that with the philanthropists all chasing each other to invest in CCS. Where could that money go otherwise? So it's a difficult one, because I wouldn't say no to it, but the thing that we came up with in this project was that you need to separate it out from carbon reduction. You need carbon removals in a separate pot from carbon reduction, in terms of targets, in terms of incentives and policy, and in terms of investment. In fact, it all gets muddled together. Why does it get muddled together? Because it's politically convenient for governments and company, airlines, Shell, they all do it. They all say that they're bothered about, that they will reach their targets through the net bit of net zero. If we had clear separation, which is politically incredibly difficult, but if we had clear separation of targets and policies and incentives, we wouldn't have that problem. But the reason that would be difficult is because it removes a giant get out clause.
Thank you. And by the way, Ellen has commented about the too much net and not enough zero that I'd quoted early on.
Absolutely.
Comment on that. Do you want to amplify, just in answer to that, what you think the comment means? I mean, I've got my view of what I think it means, but what do you think it means?
Is that to me?
Yes, sorry, Becky.
Yeah. It's been really interesting watching the sort of linguistic development of the net zero term, hasn't it? I mean, the brilliant thing about the shift from, in 2019, the shift in the UK from having a 80% reduction target to a net zero target is that it made it absolutely clear that net zero is an economy-wide project, that everyone has to play their part, every company has to play their part, but the net in net zero is just doing a huge amount of work, and I think it's really problematic. I'm a bit I don't know what we do about that. I mean, the only thing I keep coming back to is really rigorous, this point about separation, really rigorous separation. It should be in carbon reporting standards for companies. It should be in the way that the Climate Change Committee report on progress against carbon budgets and so on. And we should voice this, what we called mitigation deterrence, the fact that it detracts from conventional carbon reduction. We should voice this issue and talk about it. And we don't talk about it, but it's because it's politically difficult, but we absolutely have to.
Because I suppose at the very worst, organisations, companies, governments do nothing until 2049 and then say they're going to plant a few trees. I mean, that would be the worst bit of net, wouldn't it? And not nearly enough.
Well, the proposed coal mine in Cumbria near me, the local authority in their planning statement about it said that it would be compatible with the Climate Change Act because it would close down in 2049.
Okay, so there you go. There you go. And probably ringed by a little forest as well. Let's move on to Richard Sully. Actually, it's a question aimed at Andy, but I think it goes broader than that. Interested in thoughts on the devolution of reduction targets to go hand in hand with the budgets to deliver them. Is there a disconnect? It's a great question, actually. Is there a disconnect between the national 2050 legal target and local voluntary aims and aspirations? I see, Mike, you're typing an answer, but while you do, Andy, let's get your thoughts on that.
I think the only answer you can say is yes, probably there is. You know, the wave of climate emergency declarations that went through local authorities in 2019-20 was, you know, hugely impressive and I think really, really significant development. However, I think that, you know, if you look across this region now, as a region, we have a target of net zero by 2038, but with significant progress by 2030. And I think virtually all of the local authorities also have net zero targets now, if not all of them. But I think they're all facing the same issue now, which is, you know, it's easy to sign up to a target and much harder to work out how to deliver it and much harder still to actually deliver it. And I think we are lacking in the kind of early warning systems, which will tell us whether local authorities are on track or not. And we won't know until too late if they're not on track. To give you a...
But presumably it's preferable for local authorities, cities, regions to come up with their own targets rather than have them imposed from Whitehall.
Absolutely. And even better for them to come up with their own plans on how to deliver it. Yeah. And ideally, they could fund large parts of it themselves. I think the green bonds movement and the potential for people to invest again in their own city or their own area, and then to swim in the swimming pool that they've helped to heat through the solar panels they've helped to fund and meet the job they've helped to create. To me, that's really exciting. That's the kind of back to the future development where, you know, you have a remunicipalization of local government funding, where the benefits stay in the area, and the empowering, energizing aspects of that for local populations is potentially really quite transformative. But I think in the end, we do need enabling policy from government. And without that, you know, whether it's aviation or whether it's CCS or whether it's, you know, the net zero strategy more broadly, I think local areas will really struggle. You know, in the net zero strategy, they talk about net zero hubs and repurposing the energy hubs that we have. Well, we have an energy hub for Yorkshire and the Northeast. So what's that, a population of 5.5 million or even more, 7.5 million. You know, I think it has 2 or 3 people working in it, and you know, very few people on the ground have really had much to do with them in practice. So, you know, if they're going to do it, I would say it needs to be scaled up on the one hand, much more investment, much more capacity building, but also scaled down. You know, that regional approach is still too high level. It needs to be, you know, much closer to people on the ground to really make a difference. And without that, yes, that disconnect is going to be there.
No, thanks for that. Now, look, Claire Stocks, you've got a great question. It's aimed at me, and I'm not going to duck it. I think you've reposted it because you thought I'd missed it, but I hadn't. I was coming to it, but I was going to do it towards the end. But here's the moment. So I guess you can all see the questions about the communications challenge for the BBC. Audience data clearly showing people are climate concerned. Is the BBC, especially the business, economics, politics desks, fulfilling its role in terms of holding to account and telling people the reality of what's going on? What are the difficulties? I mean, to be quite honest, I mean, I've left the BBC after 38 years, can you believe? Compartmentalization, dreadful word, and I think Mike sort of touched on this in the Whitehall context, is a problem for big news organizations. And I've seen this time and time again, that I will do a story about climate change and emissions reductions, and the next item on the bulletin or on the website, right next to mine, will be about the motor industry bemoaning falling car sales, or plans for a new bypass, or plans to expand an airport. And trying to get a big organization, I would suggest any organization, to join up on this is incredibly difficult. A few of us, and it must be said, some of the senior management really worked at this to try to address it. And it wouldn't be right to say wholly successfully, but I think we had some successes. You know, for example, I was very, very keen on the day that COP26 had the Mark Carney announcement about the global financial net zero initiative, which itself, of course, has all kinds of question marks over it. But nevertheless, the day that was published, I was very keen that the economics people did that and business people did it to bring their perspectives. And I thought the coverage that day was different and potentially more interesting. Simon Jack, the business editor, and I, and others in my old team, and his colleagues in the business team regularly compared notes about all kinds of things. And we would often encourage them to do coverage up to a point. I mean, because then you bump into no one wants to lose control of a story. But look, it's difficult. Big institutions have departments, they have teams, they have units. Getting everyone to talk together and to harmonize is very, very difficult. Claire, I hope that goes some way to answering your question. I think genuinely we made some progress, but it's an uphill struggle, and there have been some, I think, really, really bad moments when we did drop the ball collectively, but hopefully not all of the time. So let's move on to an anonymous attendee. I agree with Andy about the need to remove emissions from cement and petrochemicals, but glass and steel can be electrified or converted to hydrogen. We need a green industrial strategy. I'm sure you'd support that, Andy. But I mean, you know, these things, some of them are, I know, in their early stages. There's that Swedish steel maker, isn't there? Mike, do you want to come in? I mean, clearly the idea of fostering green industries has been around for a while. Presumably, what are the obstacles to that? Why doesn't that move more rapidly, would you say? Mike, you're on mute.
I am on mute. Sorry. Some of it, of course, has been happening. We have a very large number of jobs now in green sectors, defined with various statistical measures. And of course, we have lots of jobs that are low carbon. All the jobs in public services, in health and education and childcare and social care. These are all very low emitting jobs. I would count them as green jobs as well. And they're the kinds of jobs we need in the economy. We don't just need people making wind turbines or installing insulation. We need green jobs that are socially useful and low emissions. And so I think the caring agenda, greater investment in public services, in childcare and social care, I think is part of the green economy. I would actually say that we need a kind of green caring economy, to be perfectly honest. So there has been a lot of investment, and a lot of that, I mean, if you look at why it's happened under the influence of policy. So we've had renewable energy policy, which has effectively subsidized renewable energy. That has attracted private sector investment because the subsidies have made it profitable. As the scale of those industries has risen, and this is of course global, not just national, the green energy has become cheaper. You will remember, we talked about Copenhagen, David, in 2009. The price of solar energy, the installed price of solar energy, has fallen by around 90% since 2009, of wind energy by between 50 and 75%. The reason these things are much cheaper is because we've got more of them. We've improved their performance and we've found ways of making them more cheaply, and we've produced them at scale. So you can expand green industries, new technologies with a bit of government policy and then with a bit of scale. And that's what we need to do in other sectors. So we need to green the steel and the chemicals industries, and that will need some policy, but the technologies will emerge and then they will become cheaper over time. So, and the same is true with insulation, with heat pumps and other things, and with electric vehicles, which you can see exactly the same process. Electric vehicles used to be way too expensive. We subsidized them, the companies started making them, they started innovating, they started producing them more cheaply, and now on a lifetime basis, they are the same price as diesel and petrol vehicles. So this can be done. We need a government to instigate those initial policies, willing to put in some public investment as well as private, and then the private sector's innovation processes will begin to kick in and it will become cheaper.
Mike, many thanks. Now, I've just realized that we're right on time, if not slightly over. So forgive me for not getting to all of you who put questions, but many, many thanks to everyone who did and to those whose questions we managed to tackle. Many thanks to our panelists. I'm now going to hand back to Andy. We could carry on for hours, couldn't we? I mean, fascinating topics raised by everybody. So thank you. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you, David, and thank you for convening it so nicely and so kind of fluently. And thanks to Mike and Becky too. Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission has these events on a quarterly basis. If you haven't followed us or signed up to the newsletter, please do via the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission website. We really appreciate the input of everybody through your questions and comments today. It's a key mechanism for the public steering the Commission and feeding into our agenda. We're also developing an online kind of deliberative democracy platform at the moment to enable greater input in a more detailed way as we move forward. And if you signed up to this event and given your consent for us to use your email, then we will be in touch with you about that. So our next event is in the next quarter, as you can see on the screen, Wednesday, 15th of June. The topic for that has yet to be defined, but as soon as we're able to say what it is, or if you have thoughts on what you would like it to be, please feed in. Otherwise, yeah, thank you so much for giving your time this evening. Thanks to David and Mike and Becky again, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.